In the life cycle of buildings, people come together to collaborate. At times, there is alignment of interest and enduring trust is built. I spoke with two people who have come together in many successful project collaborations over time. Alexandra Thom, a brand strategist and the creative director at Revolver, a branding studio based in New York City, who says the best work results from being pushed and challenged by clients and collaborators.
You sort of want to allow space for risk and for experimentation.
And Karen Zabarsky, a real estate strategist and founder of Ground Up, a consultancy based in Austin, Texas, who says the most successful professional relationships are guided by a long-term approach and mindset.
People remember you and they see opportunities that come up and they try to bring you into things.
I'm Drew Lang, the founder of Brick & Wonder. This is the Brick & Wonder Podcast. Welcome to the Brick & Wonder Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'm excited about this conversation. So, Karen, I understand you studied urban design and architecture at NYU.
Yes.
And then you made your way into the professional world, working inside architecture firms. And along the way, you fell in love with storytelling. You moved over to work on the development side with the Kushner Company.
Yes.
And then you have come to where you are now. You have your own consultancy in the real estate and design space. We're going to talk about that.
Yes.
And you're the editor-in-chief of Austin Home Magazine. Talk to me a little bit about your journey, right, from your education to where you are now and how you feel like you were formed.
Well, I think what's interesting is that when I started out my career, I knew I loved architecture. I knew I loved cities, actually, primarily, more so even than architecture. And I knew I loved writing and all of these kind of disparate things, but I really had no idea where it was going to go. And what's interesting is that when I was studying urban design and architecture, like you said, I was pretty sure I was going to be an architect. And I even went so far as to take Calculus 3 at NYU. That is serious commitment. And I was getting my portfolio ready and ready to apply to all these architecture schools. And then I got a job with an architecture firm my senior year as I was getting my applications ready at Studio V Architecture, which is very much still a thriving firm here in New York. And it was on their business development team. And it was just kind of this role, I didn't have my architecture license yet, et cetera. So I just wanted to work for a firm and jump in. And just starting to be in that role of getting to work with all of the architects and understand not just the designs, but also where they come from and all the research that goes into it and how much thought architects put into the impact that these buildings will have on the cities and quality of life. That to me, that kind of layer of impact and, the ripple effects across cities of even one building is really what kind of captured my heart. And so my internship turned into a full-time position with them. From there, I went to SHOP, which was a very similar position, kind of 1 foot in design, 1 foot in business development, but obviously on a very big, almost institutional scale at that point when I was at SHOP. It was the era of Vishan and, I think in the past year they had doubled to 200 people, so SHOP was enormous. So I got to see on an even bigger scale that being able to tell that very clear story. And by story, it's not this kind of fake marketing, name on a building or something. The real story of the impact of these projects, it's kind of half the battle in addition to the design itself.
Talk more about that for a second. So the story of the impact, how do you get at that?
One thing I realized, when I was on the architecture side, and then like you said, I went over to the ownership side, is that you can have the most amazing, thoughtful design in the world. And if you're not able to get the final decision makers on board, it doesn't matter. because unless there's someone who has full kind of blind faith in you, that's the final decision maker and just says, whatever you think, let's just go ahead, which is pretty rare. It's not going to go through. There are certain other priorities that either ownership or, by the way, people in city administration, they have other priorities. And so being able to tell the story of a design, why are we using these materials? Why are we creating a dimensional retail scape? Why are we creating these paseos that go through the building? Where have we seen those examples in other parts of the world? And why are they so successful? And why is that the perfect thing for this neighborhood specifically? And how is this, new amenity going to help the local ecosystem here? Being able to tell the vibrant basically argument for why these elements of design need to happen, help those decisions go through.
That's so interesting, right? That the first place you're going to and talking about the impact is working with your team, arming your team members with the powerful version of the story in order to carry the client, the decision maker on a project along with them to go to the most impactful place that the project can go. So interesting. So, Alexandra, I understand you grew up in New York City. You were always, from a young age, oriented towards art, making art. You went to Vassar College, and you ended up studying art history and specifically Gothic architecture. You really doubled down on this, did a master's degree. You made your way through the professional world in the nonprofit sector. And then for the last 10 years, you've been at Revolver and carved out an interesting role for yourself.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about the journey, which is an interesting one, I know, and where you find yourself today.
Yeah, I had mentioned to you, Drew, that doing this work with you, sort of having these conversations, giving the talk that I gave however many months ago, provided this opportunity to sort of look back and identify some of the through lines that I might not otherwise have been able to sort of pin down. But that's right. I sort of grew up always wanting to sort of make things, make art, write. And I sort of discovered medieval art and Gothic architecture sort of by happenstance. I took a class that was sort of a requirement to graduate and fell in love with this professor who was doing a research program with Columbia University to photograph Gothic churches around France, looking at the cathedral as a source of geopolitical ambition, as well as sort of an architectural object, if you will, or space. And I really fell in love with the field. And I think, also became fascinated in spaces and the way that we as individuals occupy spaces, how spaces affect us. And when I found my way to Revolver all these years later, our work is really about defining brands that exist in places and thinking about how those places impact us.
And where you are now, when you're trying to choreograph a special experience for people in places when you're working on the brand story, what is that? So
branding should feel intuitive, but it's also invisible, right? It's not something that you should walk into a space and say necessarily. Obviously there's the graphic identity that you'll see in sort of select locations when you occupy a space, but it shouldn't be something that jumps out at you, that knocks you over the head. And this is in particular where the sort of brand strategy work comes in, which is really my focus. The graphic identity should express the strategy, but the strategy in and of itself should be something that's palpable when you walk into the space. And I think that a lot of the it should explain why people feel a certain way in the space without them necessarily being able to put their finger on it. And some of that's through sort of experiential touch points. We talk a lot about this in our work, sort of how does the brand strategy lend itself to very particular experiential touch points. For example, sort of what is the scent, and scent is, I bring up scent first because scent is fascinating, right? It's the one sort of sense that isn't circuited through your frontal cortex. So it's experienced on a very sort of emotional level, and it immediately takes you somewhere. So it's this power that we have, or that you have as an operator to immediately take guests who enter your space to a particular emotional place. And ultimately that scent profiles should be determined by the brand story. Like, where is that place we want our guests to go immediately upon entering a space?
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. You can take people to the wrong place.
Right.
But how do you take them to the right place?
Well, this olfactive branding is like its own sort of category, I think, in a lot of ways, where I couldn't tell you sort of why a particular scent takes someone to a particular place necessarily. But what I can tell you is that, we know that a brand story should be evocative of a set of feelings. For example, if we're talking about a historical building, we don't want that experience to feel like, you're walking into a museum necessarily. We want it to feel like a hospitality-driven experience. But at the same time, you want the sense of being in a space that has layers, right? Where there's potentially tension between what's new and what's old. You have a sense that you're being surrounded by stories of the historic, whereas I think there are, if you are talking about a space that is new construction, you're talking about like even a residential space, for example, you might want those sort of sensory cues to be much more about, rooting someone in the present moment, a sense of exhilaration, a sense of optimism. So I think that brand and emotion are inextricably linked.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's a lot of layers of sort of work that need to go into creating a story before you get to that emotional output, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Tension seems like the right word to me.
Yeah.
And this experience of being pulled different places. So, Karen, moving from Kushner into your own consultancy, how's that gone? And tell me about the range of the work that you do and the kind of people that you're working with.
It's going great. What I would say is that when I was in-house, there was something that I noticed was kind of the pattern of how the creative life of these new developments go, the trajectory of these new developments, that while I was in-house with Kushner, we already kind of started to change, and that I brought into ground up. So just to be specific, what I noticed is that in a typical development, and this is true, I think, across the board, the developer starts with, they acquire a site. They say, okay, let's bring in the architect, whoever, let's make it as efficient as possible. Okay, done. Goodbye, architect. Then the interior designer comes in. Okay, let's, make this pretty. Okay, goodbye, architect leaves. Then a branding agency comes in at the last mile, like close to when the doors open. And they say, okay, let's find a nice name. Let's put the name, let's make some marketing collateral. And what I saw is that it makes for a lot of arbitrary decisions along the way, in the sense that, developers have to make a million different decisions in the trajectory from pre-development, development, construction, and then opening. And those decisions are typically made either by the decision of the developer, one person's opinion, which if it's a great developer, hopefully they have a killer instinct for that stuff. Or, you kind of look at the comps and say, well, let's do either the same or like a little better. And that's kind of how you make those decisions. What I saw when I was in-house, which again very much translates into ground up, is that we started to flip the process in the sense that, a site would be acquired and then immediately we go into kind of this deep dive strategy and positioning and say, okay, and we did this especially with our hotel projects, very typical in the hospitality world, but then it came into residential too. Okay, what's the history of this site? What did it used to be? How did it develop now? What is the current culture of this neighborhood? What's the context? What do people need here? Are we missing cafes? Are we missing restaurants? Are we missing a vet? Are we, what are the other buildings that are coming up here over the next 5 years that we know about? And starting with this kind of very strategic approach that then creates a guidebook for all of the other decisions that come. So obviously, a lot of decisions are guided by money and budget. That's very important. But saw that when we would go into, a hotel on the Jersey Shore that we were building or a residential building in Edgewater in Miami, and we had this kind of strategic thought, it suddenly became a little more obvious, like, oh, of course the tenants here are going to care more about this than that. Or, oh, of course we should bring in this local ice cream shop to go in here as opposed to a 24-hour care, whatever, So it was very helpful in making those decisions. So when I left and started Ground Up about 2.5 years ago, I brought in very much so that kind of approach. And, we come in at all stages, especially as a growing company. But the dream is to come in at the beginning and really be able to say, how do we make this place a treasure for the community and for ownership? And do that in a very kind of research-driven, data-driven way so that it's easier to make decisions all throughout. So the way Ground Up does that is we do strategy, design, and branding. And we serve essentially as a creative director for real estate development teams. We don't replace the interior designer. We don't replace the architect. We really act as kind of a new role within the team that comes from a very strategic perspective. And that's a lot of the work I do with Revolver, of course, with Alexandra, and really kind of bring in this additional dimension to ensure that decisions are made very thoughtfully, including from a business perspective. And that at the end of the day, when the doors open to new projects, new developments, anyone who walks through those doors can feel the thoughtfulness that went into them.
So, Alexandra, I know that you've done some projects over the past number of years with Karen Zabarsky. Tell me a little bit about how that's gone.
So I met Karen through Brick and Wonder. Actually, I had met her briefly when she worked at Kushner, but we reconnected through Brick and Wonder. And, it's one of those things where you sort of never know how it's going to go when you first start working with a freelancer. And Karen and I, from the beginning, just really sort of saw eye to eye and have had such a great sort of collaborative understanding. And just also shared enthusiasm for the work, which I think is really important. And I think also Karen, with her design background and architectural background, is sort of uniquely suited to do this work in a way that's very, there's no other sort of strategist I work with who has that who has that background. So we worked on upwards of 9 projects. So traveled to as many, cities together, and sort of really gone through the process together, many times over at this point.
What does that collaboration look like?
So really, in a literal sense, Karen is the strategist. So she's the one sort of doing the work, presenting it to the client, and I'm sort of overseeing that work. And so I always want to be respectful, whether it's strategy or whether it's creative, to allow the person doing the work to sort of to own the work, right? And to have a strong sense of where it should go. And if there's disagreement, 9 times out of 10, I'll sort of defer to her perspective. And often where I'm coming from is a sense of sort of what the client might want. And that's not, even if you know what the client might want, it's not always where you want to land, particularly in the early stages of developing work. You sort of want to allow space for risk and for experimentation. And so, there's a natural build to our strategic work also, where we sort of start by laying a foundation, by sort of identifying the unique qualities of a site, by defining the audience, by sort of looking at sort of the marketplace and the location and the unique sort of moment in time in which we're doing this work. I think people talk about sort of strategy work and branding as something that should be timeless. And I think that's true to an extent, I think we are all creatures who exist in a moment in time, and we would be remiss not to sort of infuse that into the work that we do in some way. And so Karen will sort of build out those components, but, we're in conversation as those components are being built out. So as I said, we'll often travel to the site as a sort of a first step in the project and meet with the client. And so when we're taking those trips and doing that work, we're in dialogue. What about the site feels interesting or unique? And I think this is something I often say to our clients when we pitch, but we all talk about internally too, is when you've worked on 9 projects together, or you've worked on 100 projects in your career, you're sort of, those projects are in conversation with each other too, in a way that is like beneficial to the work. So we're able to say, well, how is this unique? How is this different? How much risk should we take? We're able to sort of just talk through those things. And then what we call the brand platform or the brand story really builds over time through the rounds of work and in conversation internally and also in conversation with the client.
Yeah. The more work that you do with one another, the better the work becomes.
Totally.
Yeah. You mentioned Alexandra and Revolver. Talk to me about the process and the degree of success you've been able to achieve working with them.
It's been incredible. And what's amazing is that, Alexandra and I met at a round table and just kind of instantly loved each other. And we kind of started talking about, could we work together in a marketing capacity? Or it was a very long-term thought and just saying like, we like each other, we like what we're doing, let's try to figure out how to work together. And so Alexandra approached me and she said, I know your background, I know what you've done, I know what you're trying to do with Ground Up, which is kind of very strategic work, very interdisciplinary. And so she asked me if I would be interested in launching into a strategic scope for one of their projects. It was a 100-year-old historic hotel in San Antonio. And I live in Texas, so that was, of course, perfect. But we dove into it, and it was really an amazing collaboration. We traveled to San Antonio together. We did a deep dive site immersion together, which is a signature move of Revolver, which of course, resonates with me deeply. They do this very deep dive discovery and immersion with the client. And Alexandra and I both especially have a really deep appreciation for history, for the characters, who was in the hotel, what was the, concert that was played here that changed the lore of this place, and telling that story. And it was also a very fortunate experience of working with Marriott on that first project, which they, actually require, I think in most cases, for branding and positioning to be done before completing interior design. So that was our first project together. It went amazing.
Okay. So it seems like you've had some good success. How would you, when you step back from things, define success in your professional relationships?
I think what defines success for me is thinking about professional relationships long term. I've noticed this in people who kind of come to me for certain things, and maybe also how I used to conduct myself when I was much younger. But people sometimes go into professional interactions in kind of a transactional way, like, oh, I just met you. What can you do for me? What can I do for you? What I found, in hindsight, certainly my relationship with Alexandra and Revolver is a great example of this, is that there are certain relationships I've had of people that I just went to grab a coffee with. We just, just to get to know each other, no kind of end goal, that then kind of start to come up over the years, and people remember you and they see opportunities that come up and they try to bring you into things. So I think the most successful professional relationships are really when you're just kind of curious and excited about what someone else is doing, and without necessarily going into it with an end goal in mind, and just kind of, being nice and warm and curious.
Mm-hmm. So when things don't succeed,
things always succeed, Drew. What are you talking about?
Right. So for those rare times
yes.
when you have setbacks, let's talk about that for a second. Maybe tell me about one instance of a really significant setback in your professional journey.
Well, one example, certainly there have been, many non-successes. One of them that comes to mind that then turned into a smashing success was actually with Alexandra, where she really changed my perspective, actually in a way that still resonates with me today. We were working together on a project. had worked on it very hard together. And we got to this really great place after several rounds of iterations, and, thought that we had sign off from the client. Great. And then the operator saw the presentation and they basically sent us a Megillah. They sent us like this 10-page document of everything that was wrong with the presentation. And, I was just, sometimes creatives don't take feedback very well. Okay, I usually do, but I don't know what was happening with me that day. I was just like, this is ridiculous. We just have to tell him no. It's already approved. And I, was already getting ready to tell Alexandra, like, look, I don't have the time. I don't know. And then I spoke with her and she said, I love it when we get feedback like this. And I was like, what? You love it? What? Mm-hmm. And she said, you know what? When we get feedback like this, it's like a puzzle. It's like a puzzle of like figuring out what do we have to do here to get to the end goal, the right answer with this client. And that was such a different mentality from anything I'd experienced before or heard before from other people. I really kind of absorbed that mentality and we worked through it together. And thank goodness, because I might have had a nervous breakdown otherwise, we represented, the material to the operator and they loved it. But it really was a moment where on my own, maybe that relationship with that client would have ended really differently. And because I kind of leaned on her frame of mind and approach, it completely turned things around. And it's something that I've truly taken with other even non-Revolver projects when I get feedback from clients, really shifted my perspective.
I think I was less shocked, not because of the work, but because I'm used to receiving all sorts of feedback from clients. And, it was really interesting because in retrospect, I think it was one of the best projects we did together. I mean, I had just said to you, and I stand by this, that, as we've done more and more projects together, they've gotten better and better. But this first project is particularly sort of close to my heart. And in a way, it's because we had to sort of work through this really tough client feedback. And I actually do believe that, more often than not, tough clients make for better work. And when I say tough, there's nuance to that, right? Of
course.
I mean, clients that push you and give thought-provoking critical feedback make for better work. And so, I think sometimes success in a project is, if you sort of step back, successful brand strategy informs great brands, right? Like that's in the simplest way, right? That if you see a truly magnificent graphic identity, I would wager to guess that exists because there was strong strategic thinking behind it. And strong strategic thinking can look like all sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily need to be a formal deck, but it comes from a really deep understanding of the unique set of qualities, characteristics inherent to that brand. And the job of strategy is to bubble that to the surface and make that something that is palpable down the line for a guest, but also in the short term is palpable for, it serves as sort of a creative brief for the rest of the teams that will be executing that brand, right? So for the graphic designers, for the olfactive branding team, if that's something that the client is doing. And so, success for brand strategy is something that inspires great work in other people. But I also think that if you just sort of look at the brand strategy work in isolation, I think that the work that is most challenging, that is most sort of thought-provoking, that requires you to sort of revisit it and sort of rake through it, often also I think is the most successful. When you have almost the most narrative threads to pull from, like, what story are you going to tell? It's there's lots of different potential. There's not a single story, but I feel like you said something to this effect when we spoke on the phone the other day, Drew, like it was about something totally different. You were talking about sort of like winning new business, but you want for the work that you produce at the end to feel inevitable. Like, oh, it couldn't have been any other story. That's the only story that matters.
Have you, in your professional journey, experienced any major setbacks?
So just before the pandemic, we had a partner at the agency who left unexpectedly. And what I learned and what I'm so glad I did at the time was look outside the agency for mentorship, and to really identify some folks who could teach me about what good leadership is and help me to recognize that that's an ongoing journey, right?
Yeah. So speaking of obstacles, Karen, if you could change one thing about our profession as a whole, what would you change?
I think it actually really goes back to how people think about branding. It kind of goes back to what I was describing in terms of the order that people think about this stuff. I think this is actually changing a lot, but especially kind of the older school, more traditional thought of branding is like it's a logo or it's a color palette. And from my perspective, I almost feel like we need like a new word for it or something, because the idea of branding, to me, 21st century concept of branding is that it is about what does this place do for a person? What does it do for a city? How does it tell that story in a million different ways through, yes, the logo, but also the lobby, the design, the landscaping, the dimensionality of the retail, all of those things from my perspective are a part of the positioning and the branding. And it kind of, bleeds everything together. So I think that would be my one wish, is that we start to think about the creative participants of a project, whether it's creative director, branding agency, some of those people that you kind of think of as coming in last, and really invert the order to create more magical spaces. Magical is the scientific term for
Yeah, no,
spaces.
I think it's appropriate. Magical is good. It's very meta. You want to rebrand branding.
Yes.
So it's
oh my gosh.
You rename it, rebrand it, the whole thing. So
Wow.
I have a feeling you and Alexandra are going to do that. I want to know what you'll come up with.
We're trying.
Yeah. When I think about just sort of the dynamics of our profession, of sort of creative service provider and client, I wish people took more risk, right? I wish people got out of their way more frequently. I wish people sort of understood their own,
By people, who do you mean? Everyone?
I mean clients, but I mean everyone else. I mean clients in particular, but I mean everyone. I think that part of the challenge of this work is sort of being able to see where you as an individual start and stop, and the sort of work in the world starts and stops, and being able to sort of identify that line, or understanding whether it's important to like something or to know that it works. Those are two different things. And I think sometimes individual preference is a really important place to start in providing feedback and sort of receiving work, whether it's strategic thinking or visual work, graphic identity work, what have you, naming in particular. But sometimes it's not, what you like or don't like isn't the helpful framework. And that's why strategy exists. It should be about sort of, is this the right decision for the brand? And I think sometimes people are sort of inhibited by their own preferences and can't look beyond
Of course.
their
So
own
are
preferences.
you talking, I mean, this is interesting, right? Because are you talking about creative risk, or are you talking more about market risk, commercially oriented risk, or can you not talk about those things separately? Are they necessarily intertwined?
I'm talking about creative risk specifically, but I think that the most interesting work happens when they're intertwined, right? And I think I'm less educated about market risk. I'm often also surprised at the degree to which those things don't go hand in hand. You could have sort of a developer or a client who's taken sort of a really interesting market risk, but then isn't interested in taking creative risk. And I think we can still create good work in that framework. But if I'm sort of stepping back and looking at the profession at large, I think that, if people were willing to sort of go out on a limb more, it would make for a more interesting world, as a general principle.
In the projects that you're working on currently, are there any collaborators that you're currently looking for?
One of the conversations we have a lot internally is sort of the relationship between branding and marketing. I think a lot of people see branding and marketing as synonymous. I don't see it that way. I think that branding can be a component of marketing, but that branding is sort of its own thing. And I think requires its own sort of set of skills. But often we get RFPs that look for sort of a suite of services that extend from branding through to kind of the outreach implicit in sort of a marketing deliverable. Branding sort of requires sort of that foundational work and the ability to sort of design materials that then a marketer will go out and use to sort of sell a product or a project. And so I am currently sort of thinking about how do we sort of engage with marketing so that we can sort of extend our set of offerings to go those few steps further. So that is something that I've started to think about. I'm not maybe being super articulate about what we need because it's sort of early days of thinking about it. But
well, maybe we can talk about what today does the engagement of marketing look like, right? Does it sit primarily in the digital space? Is it social media marketing and targeted digital advertising? Is that what it is?
Yes, that plus other things. But yes, that is a big piece of it.
Yeah, I always feel like the right client also helps lead you to the right
totally.
people.
That's a really good point, Drew.
Yeah.
I should give that more thought.
Karen.
Oh, yes. So I would say on two fronts. One is with Ground Up. What's my model for the company is I'm the only full-time employee. And then for every project I work on, I put together kind of a very curated army of incredible freelancers. So I have one project specifically that's coming up where I'm looking for an incredible graphic designer from a branding perspective, creative director for photo shoots, and in general, just kind of always looking to grow that arsenal of amazing freelancers. Can be remote, can be anywhere in the United States or beyond. And then much more specifically and regionally in Austin. So you mentioned I'm also the editor of Austin Home magazine, which is an amazing publication. It's a 20-year-old Austin-based publication of kind of the city's design. And there, I'm really looking to find people and projects that haven't really been getting the spotlight, which I've found is a lot.
So you want the designers and the owners who are creating projects
in Austin
to come to you with those.
Yes,
so you can
please.
tell their stories in the publication. Okay, cool.
And
so how do they do that?
craftsmen.
How do people get in touch with you? How do they find you?
They can send me an email. My email is Karen, Karen, at groundupideas.com. And I'm not always amazing at answering emails, to be honest with you. But if you send me something really cool, I'm here for it.
Okay. Anywhere else people should look to learn more about you?
I think if you go to groundupideas.com, that pretty much says it all. And if you're in Austin or just interested in the magazine, that's austinhomemag.com.
Great. So, Alexandra, if people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, how do they do that?
They can email me.
What's your email address?
at@revolvernewyork.com. I think that's the best way.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to anyone who'd be interested in getting in touch.
And your website, social channel?
Yeah, so revolvernewyork.com, and all the social channels are there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun, Drew.
All right.
Thank you so much.
That was Alexandra Thom, a brand strategist and creative director at Revolver, and Karen Zabarsky, a real estate strategist and founder of Ground Up. Alexandra and Karen are currently anticipating their next commission, which will be their 10th project collaboration. Thank you so much for joining us. This episode was produced by the team at Radio Kismet, including Christopher Plant and Justin Berger. The production and editing staff also included Brick & Wonder team members Ed Thompson, Kerry Potter, Roya Osuli, and Ray Hirschfeld-Smith. I'm Drew Lang, and you've been listening to the Brick & Wonder Podcast.